The schoolhouse smelled of fresh pine and lamp oil. Richard Brennan stood at the back of the room, hat in hand, watching his son Thomas settle onto a bench among 20 other children. Late October had turned the cottonwoods gold outside the windows, and the evening air carried the promise of first frost. The new teacher stood at the front, hands folded at her waist. She wore a simple gray dress that matched her eyes, and her dark hair was pulled back in a modest bun. Something about her made Richard's chest tighten. "My name is Sarah Hartley," she said, her voice clear and gentle. "I've come from Kansas to teach your children not only their letters and numbers, but also character and compassion." The school board chairman nodded approvingly. "Miss Hartley is a widow. Folks, came highly recommended from the Territorial Education Board." Richard's coffee cup stilled halfway to his lips. Those eyes, storm gray and steady. He'd seen them before, but the memory slipped away like smoke. Sarah spoke about her teaching philosophy while parents listened, some nodding, others whispering approval. She moved with quiet authority, her gestures economical and purposeful. When she smiled at a nervous child, Richard felt an inexplicable stab of unease. "Your children will be safe here," Sarah said. "They'll learn to read, to cipher, to think for themselves. But most importantly, they'll learn kindness." The meeting ended with handshakes and introductions. Richard found himself in line, Thomas at his side. The boy was already smitten, chattering about how pretty Miss Hartley was, how nice her voice sounded. When Richard's turn came, Sarah extended her hand. Her palm was warm, her grip firm. "Mr. Brennan," she said. Their eyes met. Something flickered in her expression, recognition. Maybe, or its shadow. "I've heard much about you." "Ma'am," his voice came out rougher than intended, "my son speaks highly of you already." "Thomas is a lovely boy." She looked down at the child with genuine warmth. "I can already tell he has a kind heart." The moment passed. Richard moved on, but the unease followed him out into the October night, walking home with Thomas. He listened to his son's excited chatter about the new teacher, about books and learning and how lucky they were to have someone so fine. Above them, stars emerged in a darkening sky. The settlement's lights began to glow small beacons against the vast frontier darkness. Richard's ranch lay 2 miles out, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, a herd of 200 cattle, a timber house that had replaced the dugout he'd started in 25 years ago. Everything he'd built, everything he'd earned. But that night, lying in bed, Richard couldn't sleep. Sarah Hartley's face hovered in his mind like a half-remembered dream. Those gray eyes held something he couldn't name, familiarity that disturbed him, recognition he didn't understand. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Richard stared at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in years, like a man standing on ground that might give way beneath him. 2 weeks passed. November brought frost that silvered the grass each morning and turned breath to mist. Richard told himself to stay away from the schoolhouse, but found himself lingering at drop-off, inventing reasons to pause. This morning he'd arrived early, before the other children. Through the window he could see Sarah at her desk, preparing lessons. The lamp on her table cast warm light across papers and books. She worked with focused grace, occasionally pushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Thomas ran inside, calling a greeting. Sarah looked up, smiled, welcomed the boy. Richard remained outside, boots rooted to the cold ground, watching through glass like a man afraid to enter a room where judgment waited. Sarah helped a struggling student with arithmetic, her patience luminous. She pointed to numbers, explained quietly, encouraged gently. The child's face brightened with understanding. Then she looked up. Her eyes found Richard through the window, their gazes locked. Recognition struck like lightning, simultaneous, devastating, complete. 30 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. Richard saw it in her face. She knew. She'd always known. And in that instant, memory crashed through him with sickening clarity. Those eyes, storm gray, He'd seen them before, wet with tears, in a 14-year-old girl's face as she watched her father sign away their farm. Jacob Hartley. The name returned like judgment pronounced. Sarah's expression remained composed, but something in it confirmed everything. She knew exactly who Richard Brennan was. She knew what he'd done. Richard stumbled backward, turned, walked rapidly toward his horse. His hands shook as he gathered the reins. The ride home passed in a blur of churning memory and rising dread. That night, sleep was impossible. Richard sat in his study, lamp burning low, staring at ledgers he couldn't read. His mind replayed all the ambitious young man he'd been, hungry for empire, willing to do whatever it took. Jacob Hartley's 160 acres had sat between Richard's 2 parcels, prime grazing land with a creek running through it. When the drought hit in '55, Richard hadn't offered help. He'd offered a loan with impossible terms, knowing Jacob couldn't pay, knowing foreclosure would follow. The courtroom victory, legal, yes. Honorable, no. Jacob had lost everything: land, livestock, hope. The family had loaded a wagon and disappeared eastward. Richard heard years later that the man had died, broken by loss. He'd buried the guilt under success, told himself it was just business. Frontier economics. The strong survived. The weak fell. That's how empires were built. But there had been others. The Millers, who lost their homestead when Richard bought their mortgage from a desperate bank. Pete Richardson, squeezed out through water rights manipulation. 4 more families, each with their own story of ruin. 7 names. 7 fortunes destroyed to build his own. And now Jacob Hartley's daughter taught his son. Richard stood at his bedroom window as dawn broke, staring at 3,000 acres built on ruins. His empire sprawled before him in the growing light, cattle grazing peacefully, fences straight and strong, buildings solid and prosperous, all of it tainted, all of it stained. Sarah Hartley knew exactly who he was, and there was nowhere to run. Richard opened the old ledger from 1855. His handwriting from 30 years ago stared back at him, young, confident, careless. 7 names listed with dates and property descriptions. Jacob Hartley's name appeared third. Each name had been a calculation, each family a stepping stone. He remembered Jacob clearly, now a decent man, hard-working, trying to hold on during the drought. The farm had been in his wife's family for 2 generations. Their daughter Sarah had been maybe 13 or 14, bright-eyed and hopeful, helping her mother with washing while her father worked the parched fields. Richard had visited them that summer, ostensibly to discuss cooperation. He'd sat at their table, drunk their coffee, watched young Sarah serve pie with shy politeness, all while planning how to take everything they had. The loan came with clauses Jacob didn't fully understand. When payments couldn't be met, and Richard had ensured they couldn't be, the foreclosure was swift and merciless. Richard had sat in that courtroom, watching Jacob's shoulders slump as the judge ruled. The man had aged a decade in an afternoon. Sarah had been there too. Richard remembered now, standing beside her weeping mother, gray eyes dry but devastated, watching her whole world crumble. Those same eyes now watched Richard's son learn to read. The irony was vicious. Thomas adored Miss Hartley. The boy talked of nothing else: her kindness, her stories, how she made learning feel like magic. Last night he'd begged his father to let him bring her wildflowers. "She's the best teacher in the whole territory, Pa," Thomas had said, face glowing with innocent admiration. "I'm so lucky she came here." Richard couldn't remove his son from school without explanation. He couldn't avoid Sarah without questions from Thomas, from the community, from everyone who'd watched the new teacher arrive and transform their children's education. The past had found him, and his son's love for Jacob Hartley's daughter made escape impossible. Richard closed the ledger and locked it away. But the names remained, burned into his memory. 7 families, 7 crimes he couldn't undo. He'd spent decades building walls against guilt, telling himself success justified the methods. But those walls were crumbling now, brick by brick, Under the steady gaze of storm-gray eyes, Sarah hadn't spoken a word of accusation. She treated him with professional courtesy at school functions, greeted him politely when their paths crossed, showed Thomas extra kindness that burned Richard like hot coals. She knew. She remembered. And her silence was more damning than any condemnation could be. That night, standing on his porch, Richard looked at his empire under starlight. The cattle were bedded down, the ranch hands asleep in the bunkhouse, everything peaceful and prosperous. He'd built all this. He'd earned it through hard work and determination. No, that was the lie he'd told himself for 30 years. He'd stolen it. Every acre, every head of cattle, every plank of timber in his fine house, all built on the ruins of families he'd destroyed. And now one of those families had returned, in the form of a gentle schoolteacher who looked at his son with the kindness Richard had denied her father. There was no running from this. The reckoning had come. November deepened into December. Frost became snow. The settlement prepared for Christmas with decorations and planning, children's excitement building as the school program approached. Richard and Sarah maintained careful civility at school functions. They spoke when necessary, always polite, always proper. But tension hummed between them like wire and wind, invisible to others, but constant for them both. Richard watched her more than he should, unable to help himself. Sarah moved through the community with quiet dignity, helping families struggling with winter, organizing food baskets for the poorest homesteaders, teaching evening literacy classes for adults who'd never learned to read. She'd built a life from ashes. After Kansas, she'd worked as a seamstress. He learned from careful questions. She'd married a gentle store clerk who died of pneumonia 5 years ago. She'd put herself through normal school with money saved penny by penny, determined to teach, to give children the opportunities her father's ruin had nearly stolen from her. Everything Richard had taken from her, she'd rebuilt herself. Everything he'd destroyed, she'd reconstructed with her own hands and will. It shamed him more than any accusation could. The school Christmas program arrived on a cold Friday evening. The schoolhouse blazed with lamplight and candles, families crowded onto benches, children fidgeting in their best clothes. Sarah had rehearsed them for weeks, songs and recitations, small performances that showcased each child's strengths. Thomas stood at the front, reciting a poem about winter stars. His voice rang clear and confident. And when he finished, Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was brief but tender, a teacher's pride in a student's success. Richard watched from the back row and felt his heart break. His son beamed under her approval, glowing with accomplishment and affection. The boy whose father had destroyed her father received kindness without reservation, grace without measure. How could she do it? How could she touch Thomas with such gentleness, knowing what Richard had done after the program? Parents milled about with cider and cookies. Richard found himself near Sarah as she spoke with other families, accepting compliments on the children's performances. "Your son has real talent, Mr. Brennan," she said when others had moved away. Her voice was professional, carefully neutral. "He reads beyond his years." "You're a fine teacher, ma'am." Richard managed. "He's fortunate to have you." Their eyes met. For a moment, the careful distance wavered. Richard saw something in her expression, not anger, but a deep weariness, as if carrying a burden she'd grown tired of holding. "Miss Hartley," he began, then stopped. What could he possibly say here? Surrounded by celebration and community. Yes. She waited, patient. "I wonder, might we speak sometime privately?" Sarah's face revealed nothing. "If you wish. Mr. Brennan, after school tomorrow, perhaps. Thank you." Relief and terror mixed in his chest. That night, Richard drafted another letter of apology, trying to find words adequate to 30 years of wrong, but every sentence felt hollow, every phrase insufficient. He finally crumpled the paper and threw it in the fire. Words on paper couldn't carry the weight of what he needed to say. Tomorrow he'd face her, voice to voice, and try to find language for the guilt that had haunted him for 3 decades. Outside, snow fell steadily, covering his land in white silence. Saturday afternoon arrived cold and clear. Richard waited until the last students departed, then approached the schoolhouse. His heart hammered against his ribs. Inside, Sarah was tidying desks, organizing books. The lamp on her table cast the only light, warm against the gathering dusk beyond the windows. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm and unreadable. "Mr. Brennan," she gestured to a chair near her desk. "Please sit." Richard removed his hat, took the offered seat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. "You know who I am," Richard finally said. His voice sounded rough, uncertain. "I know what I did to your father." Sarah's hands rested calm in her lap. "I've known since the first day," she said quietly. "I recognized you immediately." The confirmation hit like a physical blow. "All these weeks, I needed to think," Sarah said, "to decide how to proceed. Your son complicates things." Her voice softened. "Thomas is a wonderful boy. It would be wrong to punish him for his father's sins." Richard leaned forward, elbows on knees, unable to meet her eyes. "I have no excuse for what I did. I was young, ambitious, ruthless. I wanted an empire, and I didn't care who I destroyed to build it. My father was a good man," Sarah said. Her tone remained even, but pain threaded through it. "He worked hard, loved his family, tried to be honest in all his dealings. What you did broke him. Not just financially, his spirit. I know." The words were ash in Richard's mouth. "I heard he died." "I'm sorry doesn't begin to—" "He died 5 years after we left Kansas." Sarah interrupted. "Pneumonia, officially, but really, he died of a broken heart. He never recovered from losing the farm, from failing his family." Richard's hands clenched into fists. "I destroyed him." "Yes." Sarah's gray eyes held his, steady and clear. "You did." The blunt acknowledgement cut deeper than rage would have. Richard had expected fury, accusations, condemnation. This calm recitation of fact devastated him more completely. "How can you stand to teach my son?" he asked. "How can you show him kindness?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I spent many years hating you, Mr. Brennan. The bitterness poisoned me, made me hard and angry. I became someone I didn't want to be." She paused. "One Sunday in a Kansas church, I realized I was destroying myself as thoroughly as you destroyed my father. Hatred was eating me alive." "Gee, so you forgave me?" Richard's voice cracked with disbelief. "I forgave you when I forgave myself for hating you." Sarah said, "The two were connected. I couldn't find peace while carrying that rage, so I let it go." Her eyes never left his face. "Thomas isn't responsible for what you did. He deserves a good education and a teacher who cares about him. My forgiveness of you doesn't depend on him suffering." Richard felt tears threatening and fought them back. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not," Sarah agreed. "But forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing freedom over chains." She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the darkening sky. "I've made peace with what happened. Mr. Brennan, I've built a new life. I'm content." Richard stood as well, feeling unsteady. Her grace was more devastating than any anger could be. He'd prepared for confrontation, armed himself against fury. Mercy left him defenseless. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching Thomas, for being better than I deserve." Sarah turned from the window. "Go home. Mr. Brennan, be a good father to your son. That's all I ask." Richard left the schoolhouse and walked into the December cold. Behind him, Sarah's lamp still burned in the window, a small beacon of grace in the gathering dark. He'd been given forgiveness he hadn't asked for. Mercy he couldn't comprehend, and it shattered him more completely than condemnation ever could. Richard appeared at Sarah's boarding house on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a sealed envelope. The landlady showed him to the modest parlor where Sarah received visitors. She looked up from her mending, surprised. "Mr. Brennan." "Miss Hartley." He remained standing, the envelope held in both hands like an offering. "I've prepared something for you." "Restitution." Sarah set aside her sewing. "Restitution." Richard handed her the envelope. "Open it, please." Inside was a bank draft. Sarah studied the amount, her expression unchanging. It was a fortune enough to buy a farm twice the size of her father's, with money left over for livestock and equipment. "I calculated the value of your father's land," Richard said, words tumbling out in nervous haste. Then added 30 years of projected profits, accounting for cattle prices and land appreciation. "It's what your family would have had if I hadn't—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "It's what you deserve." Sarah looked at the draft for a long moment, then handed it back. "I don't want your money, Mr. Brennan." Richard stared at her, stunned. "But you deserve—" What I deserved was a father who lived to see me grown." Sarah interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "What I deserved was the farm where I was born, the life we should have had. Your money cannot purchase those things. But I must make amends somehow." Richard protested. "The burden is unbearable. Please." "Let me—" "Why must I accept it?" Sarah asked. She stood, faced him directly. "Are you trying to ease your conscience? Purchase absolution." The words hit like arrows. "I just want to make things right." "You can't make it right, Mr. Brennan." Sarah's tone remained compassionate, but unyielding. "The past is the past. My father is gone. Our farm is someone else's now. No amount of money changes that." Richard felt panic rising. "Then what can I do? How can I live with what I've done?" Sarah studied him with those steady gray eyes. "Perhaps that's the question you need to answer for yourself. I've made peace with my losses. I've forgiven you freely. But your peace must come from within, not from me accepting your money." "I don't understand," Richard said helplessly. "You want my acceptance to absolve you." Sarah explained. "But forgiveness I've already given. What you're seeking is something deeper: reconciliation with yourself, with the man you were and the man you've become." She gestured to the bank draft still in his hand. "Money is what you used to destroy my father. It won't buy redemption now." Richard sank into a chair, the refused draft crumpling in his grip. His old solution: money, power. Legal maneuvering was useless here. He couldn't purchase his way free from guilt. "I've worked for 30 years to build my empire," he said quietly. "Everything I have came from what I took from others. How do I live with that? By facing the full truth of it," Sarah said. She sat across from him. "By acknowledging every person you hurt, every family you destroyed. By choosing differently now than you chose then. I can't undo it." "No," Sarah agreed. "But you can stop running from it." Richard looked up at her. "You're remarkable. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become." Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes for the first time. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth." Richard stood, pocketed the refused draft. "Thank you for speaking honestly with me, for being better than I have any right to expect." Walking back through the December cold, Richard felt hollowed out and strangely lighter. Sarah had refused his money, but given him something more valuable: a mirror to examine his own heart. If he couldn't buy redemption, how did he earn it? The question followed him home and haunted his dreams. Christmas came and went. January brought deep cold and endless stars. Richard spiraled into darkness, walking his land at night, seeing ghosts in every fence line. Jacob Hartley standing in a courtroom, shoulders slumping as judgment fell. The millers loading their wagon. Children crying. headed to uncertain futures. Pete Richardson, gray-faced and beaten, signing away water rights that made his homestead worthless. 7 families. 7 sets of ghosts haunting the empire Richard had built. He considered selling everything, disappearing. Start over somewhere no one knew his name or his crimes. But running felt like cowardice. And he'd been a coward long enough. February brought a thaw, then more snow. Richard grew distant, distracted. His foreman asked twice if he was ill. At school functions, he avoided Sarah's eyes, unable to bear the kindness in them. Then Thomas came to him with a school assignment. It's an essay about heroes. Pa, the boy said, face glowing with pride. I wrote about you. Richard's hands trembled as he took the paper. Thomas's careful handwriting sprawled across the page. My hero, my father. The essay described a man who worked hard, treated men fairly, built things that lasted. It praised Richard's business acumen, his success, his standing in the community. Thomas wrote of watching his father make decisions, settle disputes, lead with strength and wisdom. Every word was a knife to Richard's heart. His son saw a hero who didn't exist. The boy's innocent admiration was built on lies, on an empire constructed from stolen land and broken families. Thomas believed in a father who was fundamentally false. That night, Richard stood at his bedroom window, the essay in his hand. Below him, his ranch sprawled under starlight, beautiful, prosperous, utterly tainted. He couldn't let Thomas grow up believing the lie, couldn't let his son inherit wealth built on others' suffering without knowing the truth. Couldn't allow the settlement to continue honoring a man who'd achieved success through ruthless destruction. The decision crystallized like ice forming. He would confess, publicly, at the Spring Harvest Festival, when the whole settlement gathered. He would stand before them all and name his crimes, every family he'd destroyed, every acre he'd stolen, every legal trick he'd used to build his empire. All of it spoken aloud, acknowledged before witnesses, truth exposed to light. It would cost him reputation, respect, perhaps business partnerships. Some families might demand restitution he couldn't fully provide. The community might shun him, reject him, drive him out. But his son would know the truth. The victims would hear acknowledgement, and Richard might finally find peace in facing what he'd spent 30 years running from. The next morning, he went to Sarah. She opened her door, saw his face, and knew something had changed. I'm going to confess, Richard said without preamble. At the Harvest Festival in April, public confession before the whole settlement. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. That will be very difficult. Yes, Richard agreed. But I can't hide anymore. The community deserves to know who I really am. The families I hurt deserve acknowledgement. He paused. Will you be there? Sarah considered this. What would my presence mean? Witness. Richard said, testimony that I'm telling the truth, that my crimes were real and my victims suffered. You want me to stand with you? Sarah asked quietly. I want you to stand for them, Richard corrected. For your father and everyone else I destroyed. Let them see you, hear you. Know that my confession is honest. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. I will stand witness. Richard felt something crack open in his chest, not quite hope, but the first distant possibility of it. Thank you. Winter deepened. But Richard slept that night for the first time in months. He knew what he must do. Spring would bring reckoning, and he would face it with open eyes. Outside, stars wheeled overhead. Inside, the lamp burned steady. And in the darkness, the first faint stirrings of redemption began. April arrived with warmth and wildflowers. The settlement prepared for the annual Harvest Festival celebration of survival. Planting. Community. Tables appeared in the town square, laden with food. Children ran and played. Musicians tuned instruments. Richard had barely slept in days. He'd prepared his confession carefully, listing every crime, every victim, every legal manipulation. The paper in his pocket felt like lead. Sarah had arrived early, wearing a simple blue dress. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. When Richard caught her eye, she nodded once steady, encouraging. The mayor called for announcements and community business. Richard's legs felt unsteady as he stood, but his voice came out clear. I have something to say. The crowd quieted, turning to look. A confession the settlement deserves to hear. Curious faces, confused murmurs. Richard's heart hammered. 30 years ago, I was young and ambitious. He began. I wanted land, cattle, an empire, and I didn't care who I destroyed to build it. He pulled out his paper, hands shaking. I'm going to name my crimes now, specific families, specific wrongs, because you deserve to know the truth about how I built my wealth. The crowd grew silent. Richard began. Jacob Hartley, 1855. I gave him a loan during the drought with terms I knew he couldn't meet. When he defaulted, I foreclosed on his 160 acres prime land I wanted to connect my parcels. Legal, yes, but I exploited his desperation deliberately. Jacob lost everything. His family left Kansas. He died years later, broken by what I'd done to him. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard continued, voice gaining strength. The Miller family, 1857. I bought their mortgage from a struggling bank and called it immediately. They had 60 days to vacate. 3 children, 1 elderly grandmother, turned out in winter. He listed them all. Pete Richardson's water rights, the Hanson homestead, taken through boundary disputes Richard manufactured. 4 more families, each with their story of ruin. I built my empire on your suffering, Richard said, looking at faces he'd known for decades. Some of you lost land, some lost homes, some lost people you loved. I exploited drought, debt, desperation. I used the law as a weapon against those who couldn't fight back. His voice cracked. I have no excuse. I was young, ambitious, and I chose profit over principle every time. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover what I owe, but I offer it anyway. I'm sorry. The silence was deafening. Then Sarah moved. She walked forward through the crowd, each step deliberate. People parted for her, watching. She climbed the platform where Richard stood and turned to face the settlement. My name is Sarah Hartley, she said clearly. I am Jacob Hartley's daughter. Collective gasps. People who'd known her as their kind teacher suddenly saw her differently. Mr. Brennan destroyed my father, Sarah continued. Her voice remained steady. We lost our farm, our home, our future. My father never recovered. He died broken, defeated, believing he'd failed his family. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't waver. I spent years hating Richard Brennan. The bitterness nearly destroyed me, too. She turned to look at Richard. But I learned that hatred chains us as surely as any crime. I learned that forgiveness, true forgiveness, sets us free. She faced the crowd again. Mr. Brennan cannot undo the past. My father is gone. Our farm is someone else's. But he can choose differently now. He can acknowledge his wrongs, make what restitution is possible, and live with integrity going forward. Sarah's voice strengthened. I forgive him. Not because he deserves it, but because carrying rage was killing me. I choose freedom over bitterness, grace over vengeance. She extended her hand to Richard. He took it, tears streaming down his face. The settlement must decide how to respond. Sarah said, but I want you to know redemption is possible. Change is real. People can choose better than they've chosen before. The crowd stood silent, processing. Then old man Henderson, who'd lost a water dispute to Richard in '62, stood slowly. I lost my creek access to Brennan's legal maneuvering, he said. Been bitter about it for 20 years. He looked at Richard. You cheated me fair and square, using the law like a club. He paused. But I appreciate hearing you admit it. Takes courage to confess before everyone. Others began speaking, some angry, some grieving, some cautiously approving of Richard's honesty. The festival transformed into community reckoning, painful but necessary. Richard offered restitution, property returned where possible, financial compensation, donated land for a community center. Some accepted, others needed time. But Sarah's public forgiveness had opened a door. Her grace before witnesses made redemption imaginable. June arrived warm and gentle. Richard worked through his restitution commitments, meeting with families, returning property, making payments. His empire shrank, but his sleep returned. The burden he'd carried for 30 years lifted incrementally. Day by day, the settlement slowly absorbed the revelation. Some families forgave quickly, others needed months. A few remained angry, and Richard accepted that. He'd earned their rage, but Sarah's witness had mattered. Her public grace had shown a path forward. Thomas knew the truth now. Richard had told him everything, watching his son's face crumble and reform as innocence gave way to complex understanding. "You were wrong, Pa," Thomas had said, voice small. "Yes." Richard agreed. "I was very wrong. But you told the truth now," Thomas said, "and Miss Hartley forgave you." "She did," Richard confirmed, "more than I deserved." "Does that make it okay?" Thomas asked. Richard pulled his son close. "No. It doesn't erase what I did, but it gives me a chance to be better. To teach you to choose differently than I chose." Sarah continued teaching. Richard walked her home from school sometimes, conversation growing easier. They talked about books, teaching, the settlement's growth. Slowly, carefully, something new grew between them. One evening in late July, Richard stopped walking, turned to face her. "Can you truly forgive me?" he asked. "Not just say it, but feel it, because I need to know if this friendship we're building has real foundation." Sarah smiled gently. "I already have forgiven you, Richard. The question is whether you can forgive yourself." The use of his first name struck him intimate, personal, new. "I'm learning," he said quietly. "With help." "Then perhaps we're both learning," Sarah said, "to build new things from old soil." Their courtship was slow, proper, watched by the entire settlement. Richard knew people whispered the cattle baron and his victim's daughter, the wrongdoer and the woman who'd shown him grace, when he proposed in September. Under a cottonwood turned gold with autumn. Sarah accepted. "My father would want me to choose joy," she said, "to build new life rather than guard old wounds." Their wedding became community healing made visible. Families Richard had wronged attended, bearing witness to grace overcoming guilt. Old Man Henderson stood as Richard's groomsman, a gesture of reconciliation that moved Richard to tears. Sarah wore her mother's lace, carried wildflowers Thomas had gathered. Richard's hands shook, making vows he intended to keep this time. The marriage didn't erase history. Sarah kept her father's pocket watch, wore it on a chain around her neck. Richard continued restitution work, meeting commitments that would take years to complete. Some scars remained. Some families never forgave. That was their right, and Richard accepted it. But grace covered the wounds, made new growth possible. One Sunday morning, a year after their wedding, Richard and Sarah walked to church with Thomas between them. The schoolhouse stood white against blue sky, students' laughter floating from the yard where early arrivals played. Richard paused, looking back at his holdings, reduced but honest now. Land truly owned, debts truly paid. The empire had shrunk to a reasonable ranch, partnerships built on integrity rather than exploitation. Sarah's hand found his. "Ready?" she asked, gray eyes warm. He nodded. Together they walked forward into earned daylight. Behind them, in the cabin window, the lamp still burned, the same lamp that had lit Sarah's first evening at the schoolhouse, that had witnessed their first conversation, that had illuminated the path from guilt to confession to grace. a light that had welcomed a stranger home, a light that had exposed dark truth to healing air, a light that now illuminated a family built not on stolen land or legal tricks, but on foundation of mercy freely given and redemption humbly received. Thomas ran ahead, calling to friends. Sarah squeezed Richard's hand. Church bells rang across the settlement, and Richard Brennan, cattle baron no more but husband and father learning to live with integrity, walked into spring morning peace, a peace earned through confession, granted through grace, and protected through daily choice to be better than he'd been before. The past couldn't be undone, but the future stretched ahead, full of possibility for a man who'd finally learned that redemption comes not through power or wealth, but through truth spoken aloud and mercy accepted with grateful, humbled heart.